We're good to go. We are on.
If you miss this, LG, we got a new computer here now that doesn't have to bring his over here every Sunday.
Well, we shall see. We shall see.
We're on the air with it.
All right, so do you know where the word Palestine comes from? Palestine. Turns out it's the Greek version of Philistine.
Ah.
We all understand who the Philistines are. The Philistines were originally from the island of Crete, right there at the bottom of the boot of Italy, and for some reason migrated to the Gaza shores of Canaan. They're referenced in Genesis with several interactions with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They're mentioned in passing in Exodus, where when God was...
I'm just showing him that you're live.
So when God was bringing them back from Egypt into the Promised Land, He says that I'm not going to let them go through the Philistines, because if they are exposed to war this early, they'll most likely turn around and go back to Egypt, which they didn't even need war. They wanted to go back to Egypt anyway. The Philistines were advanced technologically. They were seafaring traders with weaponry that gave them one specific advantage, gave them superiority over Israel at every single turn, and that was iron. Iron was superior to bronze, which is what Israel was using at this time frame. When they talk about the history of the world, they talk about the Bronze Age and the Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age. We are witnessing that split right there. The Philistines had the early advantage of iron before it became well-known worldwide. And that's what gave them the advantage. They had those iron chariots with those spinning spears on the side that would just mow through people, and also in swords. In fact, remember we talked about in Judges, they didn't have any swords. No, it was Saul. They didn't have any swords or weapons of their own. They had to go and get them sharpened by the Philistines, because they were the only ones that had that sort of technology.
He had spears, though.
Yeah, I wish that they hadn't sharpened that one so good. It would be similar to today with someone fighting flintlocks versus someone with a machine gun. It just is totally different. And that's why whenever you hear about the Philistines, why there was such a problem for the Israelites. It wasn't their numbers per se. It wasn't they were warlike, and they did have a great experience in how to use their weaponry. But the Israelites just didn't have that sort of advantage. They had to have other things. And the big advantage that the Israelites had was God, obviously. A lot of things went, it's the same sort of thing with the American Revolution. A lot of things went our way that really shouldn't have for us to be a country. Israel had God's hand of protection over them for the most part. Every once in a while they'd do something wrong, and God would say, all right, let's see how you act without me. And then he'd come back in again, trying to teach them a lesson. Not necessarily to be advantageous to the Philistines, but to be the detriment of Israel. In fact, he said that the Philistines are going to stay in place to be a test to you guys when you're settling this land. And so that's who they are. Eventually, the Philistines dissolve away into history and just vanish away and sort of mingle in with the rest of the Canaanite cultures. And what really led to their eventual defeat is King David. They worshipped sexual paganism and sacrificed the children of these ceremonies to Baal. That was where all that influence came from. These were these guys. They drank a lot. Archaeologists in these areas have found an extensive network of breweries and wineries at every single one of the Philistine sites. If you recall, Samson's wedding was a week-long drinking binge for that whole week. Remember they said if you can answer this riddle at the end of the week, that was because that was when the drinking wedding thing was over. You know? And they were vicious when they conquered their enemies. Again, I refer you to Samson and what they did with him when they finally got him. They punctured out his eyes, they made a mockery of him, made him a spectacle, until at the last moment he used their vanity against them by killing a lot of them, by bringing it down on, not only killing them, but also himself. So as Saul saw the coming conflict with these advanced, vicious, and frightening enemies, he was led to try to communicate with God and find out, what he should do. And God did not respond. And why should he? Saul had done so many things without the need for God in the past. Who knows if he would have even taken God's advice anyway. Saul was an impressive figure. He was tall and handsome, and he very politically minded. He cared about what other people thought of him, especially his own troops. And he was led by what other people thought of him a lot. He didn't seek God's guidance. He sought his fellow man and peer pressure. That was what led him. And I suggested that he suffered from bipolar disorder, 1, and a tinge of paranoia. In the end, Saul had one ace in his pocket throughout all of these conflicts, and that was David, who was a brilliant military tactician and who had God's favor. And now his paranoia has even taken that advantage from him. So, in desperation, Saul sought out a psychic to seek Samuel for guidance. If God's not going to answer, maybe I can get a psychic to ask Samuel. And Samuel showed up, much to the dismay of the psychic, who had never seen anything like that before. And Samuel told Saul what fate was awaiting for him tomorrow. He said, Saul, his sons, the army, and Israel as a whole is going to lose to the Philistines. Now, I'm sure Saul knew what the Philistines had done to Samson and what they would do to him once the battle is over. But Saul didn't just give up, even though that he had the advanced information of the future. Now, if it had been me, and I know that, look, I hate to tell you this, I hate to break it to you, but you're going to die, your sons are going to die, your army is going to be defeated, and your country is going to get swallowed up. Just want to let you know. I would try to delay that battle. I'd say, look, I can't fight you guys today. We'll come back next week. Yeah, next week's good, you know. But no, Saul goes through with it anyway. Why? Why in the world would Saul have done such a thing? He did it because he didn't want those that were around him to think he was a coward. I believe that that's what it was. He lived and died by peer pressure. And if he had called off the battle, even though he knows what the outcome's going to be, he's read the last page in this book, he knows what's going to happen, courtesy of Samuel. It was, by the way, Samuel had been trying to tell him all this through history. He'd never listened to him. Finally, Saul listens to him. But even when he does listen to him, he doesn't follow through with the advice. Sane advice would be like, look, let's fight another day. Let's leave while my sons are still alive, while I'm still alive, while my country is still intact. Let's just postpone this. But no, he's going to go headstrong and headlong into a fight that he knows he's going to lose. I suggest that Saul went into that battle that day with the hope that he could prove God wrong, because he had never listened to God in the first place, and that he cared what his military leaders thought about him. But for whatever his reasons, the day of the battle has arrived. And so now we're at 1 Samuel 31. Oh, by the way, before we get into that, I do want to, while you're looking that up, I want to point out this chart that I've got here behind me. This is a 40-year period, okay? And Saul is tall and good-looking, and you see the rise and the fall of Saul's life. That's what this is representing. So at the very beginning, he's tall and good-looking. He's privately anointed king. Then he receives power from God. Remember, he starts prophesying. Publicly, he's acclaimed a king. And then he defeats the Ammonites, and it's a big, huge victory, remember? And they carry him off on their shoulders. And he does not give God 1 ounce of credit for the victory. And you notice that at that point, everything starts to go south on Saul. Had he, at this point, humbled himself and realized who the true victor of that battle was and given God the glory, I think this probably would have taken a totally different tack. But that was the moment that things started going downhill. Then the next thing, he disobeys Samuel by doing the sacrifice when Samuel's the only one allowed to do sacrifices. Because, once again, his men were anxious and the Philistines were pressing him, and so he's like, I got to do something. So he disobeyed Samuel. First strike. Then he disobeyed God with the Amalekites. Remember, he was supposed to kill them all, and they took all the loot. And Samuel said, what's those goats and sheep that I'm hearing bleating? That's another one. He's rejected by God as king at this point, because God has chosen someone else. We know who that is. And then he's jealous of David, who's brought in to help him, and does, but he's jealous of him, tosses his spear at David several times, hunts David down, kills those priests. Actually, he doesn't do it. He orders it done, and then the one guy does it. And then, today, kills himself. You see how the mighty have fallen, and how he was on such a good track until he got to this particular point. When he did not give God the credit and humble himself to God, that's what happens. And I think a lot of us in our lives have the same sort of pattern. When we get to the point where we take credit for what thing. If I had said, man, I was so good about getting that house, let me tell you the deal I got on that thing. And I know it. I know what was that. And it's not that I'm afraid of the fall. I'm honest about it. I know what happened to me in that house. Saul was not honest. Saul is not aware, and the blessings just keep coming. Have you noticed that? The blessings, instead of this path, mine has actually come up here and just continued on an upward track.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that there's some point where I might stumble along the way, but the point is, that what I'm trying to say is that had he given God the credit, had he humbled himself and realized that he was the number 2 man in this fight, that God is you know, the people say God is my co-pilot. No. God's the pilot.
Co-pilot.
You're just lucky to sit in the same room with him. And so Saul thought, I'm the bad man. I'm great. I'm awesome. And that's what happened.
Right.
Do you see any similarity between this and this country today?
Yeah, I do. When we had God as the leadership for our morals and all that stuff, look at the uptick, and then all of a sudden,
Democrats.
things you can say that.
Going downhill.
But I do see that. When you turn your eyes upon Jesus, and everything will go strangely dim, and you don't have any worries at that point because God will lift you up. And I do agree with you. This could be a personal story. This could be a national story. Remember, the Israelites followed this same pattern over and over again through Judges. You know, they went up and down and up and down this whole cycle. But this is a personal one about Saul's life. But like you said, it can be put anywhere.
A lot of it is pride too.
What?
A lot of it is just pride.
Pride, hubris, whatever you want to call it. But the point is that when Saul himself believed he was all that in a bag of chips.
There was an old saying that a nation is no stronger than the morals for a people.
Amen to that guy. Who said that?
I've heard it all my life.
That ought to be biblical. That ought to be biblical. So anyway, so now that you've seen what's with the fall of Saul, how God is disappointed with Saul, let's get into the actual lesson. 1 Samuel 31 verses 1 through 3, sweetheart.
Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically.
All right. So Mount Gilboa, I had a picture of it. I should have put it on here, but Mount Gilboa, the name means boiling springs, bubbling fountains, agitated pools, water bursting from rock. That's what Gilboa means. It was here, at this specific site, that Gideon satisfied the thirst of his 300 men with torches and jars as they were heading out to camp. This is where he satisfied their thirst, to defeat the Midianites. A small battle took place at this same location between the Crusades and Sultan Saladin in 1138, and the Muslim Mamluks ended the Mongol push here in 1260, which kept Egypt from being controlled by the Asian influence. What's the guy's name that we talked about? Genghis Khan.
Yeah, Genghis
riding
Khan.
through. This is where he was stopped and turned around. So this is a pretty interesting piece of dirt here. My version says that the Philistines were in hot pursuit.
Yeah.
What does yours say? Does it say hot pursuit as well?
It's fallen upon Saul.
In verse 2, the Philistines were in hot pursuit.
pursuit.
That's
The
what
Philistines fallen hard upon.
followed hard.
Yeah.
What about you, Pastor?
Pressed hard.
Pressed hard.
What'd you ask?
What does it say the Philistines were doing to Saul? Mine says
The Philistines pressed hard.
pressed hard, pushed hard. This is a rout. Okay? This is not a battle where fighting and all this stuff like we see on Civilization, where I'll punch you, you punch me, sort of thing. This is devastating. In fact, the first line of the fight says the Israelites ran. So there is no protection. Normally, the way this works is that you've got the king, the commander, in the sort of like in the rear, telling people what to do on the front. It almost is always that way. I think Patton was sort of a difference there. But for the most part, the commanders stay back in air-conditioned rooms, and they do all the battle plans.
Sit on a horse on the high ground.
You're watching it, because then they can control what other flanks, because they're the tacticians, right? Well, if all that's gone, it's just you in the front row. That's different, okay? So all of the guys who are between Saul and the Philistines sort of evaporate and just dissolve, and so now it's hot pursuit, a rout. They are coming, all right? And the Philistines...
Saul's running.
Yeah. And with the savage fighting getting closer and closer to him, Saul lost his sons, including Jonathan, to the Philistines. Now, remember, these are the same Philistines that were joined by David and his men just 3 days ago. remember we talked about this, where they had to go back and their town had been ransacked, and so they went and got all their women and children and all that stuff back. David was right there with these guys. These are the same guys, the military tacticians, the princes that said, hey, we don't want this David guy next to us in our fight. We don't need him. We don't want him. We don't trust him.
So that's the battle.
This is the guy. These are the guys. So David was rubbing elbows with these guys that are doing this route, which is why I'm grateful that God had a different plan to distract David and get him away. In fact, the story is going to pick up when David comes back to Miklal, which is his home little port there, and then he gets information about what happened to the battle. So the battle is taking place while we covered this whole thing where they were, you can't have any of yours, we'll give you your wives back, but you can't have any of the loot. Remember that whole disagreement? That's going on right now, elsewhere, while this fight is going on. The battle kept closing in on him, and eventually Saul got into range of the Philistine archers. All right. Now, what that means is that there's a certain distance where the artillery. Once you get into that artillery range, everything gets chewed up. The archers were the artillery of their day. They pull these long bows and back, and plus the tip of every single one of those arrows coming from the Philistines is an iron tip. Devastating. I mean, just slices right through and devastating. And so one of them hits Saul and mortally wounds him. Mortally wounded. It was critically hit. And this one right here, this picture's got it where and by the way, this is not a very good representation. I've seen the archers' arrows that they used. These were not that little thin pencil-sized arrow. These things were huge. They were like those dowels, that about a thumb width. I mean, these are huge miniature spears.
Missiles.
Yeah, and they'd come at a severe angle, so it wasn't that they came at you straight. It would come down and rain down on you. Normally, people
50 or 100 of them at a time.
Yeah.
Like Indians used to do the same thing.
Yeah, they'd pull and let loose, and then they'd all fire. Turns out that most of the people who got killed with these things weren't shot in the front; they were shot in the back because they were trying to dodge, like this, and the arrows would just pierce them through. So this is not a very good representation. But a couple of things I want to point out here. Number one, he's got a mortal wound. It's messing with his heart, obviously, or something. It doesn't say where he was hit, but any major laceration to any artery is going to do this. And they would recognize what the sign was of a mortal wound versus not, the blood gushing out. They know, and Saul knows. The other thing is that you see his crown is still on his head. That's going to be an important aspect later on in this story when we get around to it. I just want you to note that at this point, and the guy that he's talking to right here, that's his armor bearer. That's his caddy. That's the guy that carries all of his weapons into war. And the caddy was very helpful, and the king needed that with him. And he was the closest guy. In fact, I think David was his armor bearer at one point, was he not? I think he was when he started out. So anyway, as the arrow is in him and he's starting to suffer and he realizes that he's about to die, he sees the Philistines heading towards him, and he knows what this means. If he survives this mortal wound, even for the moment that they get close, it's not going to be good for him. They are not kind and gentle. There's no Geneva Convention back in this time frame for the treatment of prisoners, especially the king, the leadership of a nation, Israel's first king. All right, let's go back. All right, we've had several assassinations of our presidents. Imagine the devastation if Washington had been the one who had been assassinated. And there were plots to assassinate Washington too, by the way, and I do want to point that out. But think about how devastating it would have been for our mindset if our first president was slain while in office. You see what I'm saying? So this is Israel's first king. And so he sees the horde coming, and end too well for him. Dad, verses 4 through 6, please.
May I say, first of all, that my Bible indicates a plurality of arrows, not just one. It says the archers.
Yeah, the archers.
Okay.
Yeah, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him. They have multiple people. Yeah.
The archers hit him. The archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers.
I would think it's sort of like when they used to do the firing squad for people. They'd have one person with the actual bullet, and the rest of them had blanks, so you never really knew which one did it. Same sort of thing. You don't know who shot that arrow.
I mean, like you said, that guy was probably 100 yards away.
Never knew. He was just shooting blindly. He wasn't aiming for him.
That's right. Okay, 4 through 6.
Yes, sir.
Then said David to his armor bearer, "Draw that sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come in and thrust me through, and abuse me." But his armor bearer would not, for he was very much afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it.
To
And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. So Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor bearer, and all his men that same day together. All his men.
That's what it says, all his men.
Wow.
Now, what happens here is important. Saul gives his armor bearer, his wartime caddy, in order to kill him. Now, do you follow that order if that's you? You're standing there, you're the lieutenant, and your general is right there. And he says, I'm not going to let these guys capture me. I want you, and he can't shoot, he can't defend himself. He said, put me out of my misery. Do you do that? What do they say in the military? Are you supposed to do that or not? I mean, is that...
It's a direct order, you're supposed to do it, I suppose, but I don't know anybody who could.
What about you, LG? If that order came upon you, would you follow it or not?
I would never be taken alive by my enemy.
No, to kill your superior commander. To kill your superior commander at his request.
If it was necessary, yes. If I knew that he had the information they wanted,
For interrogation purposes.
then they would never take him alive.
I can see that. I can see that. But look at it this way: you'd be murdering a king if you follow that order, and that's not going to be good for you if you do survive.
A God anointed king.
Yeah, because look, what's going to happen if you survive? Let's say you survive, and you end up being reunited with the people of Israel. Let's just say you survive, you get back home.
And the investigation shows.
Yeah, you killed our king. Yeah, that's gonna be
He
a
asked
murder.
me to.
Oh, how do we know that? Did you get that in writing? You got a video of it? Or he's going to be a prisoner if he's captured by the Philistines, and we know how they deal with prisoners. So, I mean, he's in a lose-lose situation if he follows this order. He'd be viewed as a murderer on one side and a prisoner on the other. And his armor bearer, it says in mine, he was terrified. Yours said he was frightful. Mine says terrified. He was terrified at what? At the guys coming at him? I would assume so. At the fact that the destruction of his kingdom is at hand and he's right there witnessing? Yeah, probably. He was more terrified of the order.
Look at his eyes.
Yeah, he's like, you can't be serious.
Yeah.
So, and while he's dumbfounded, Saul's got no time to debate this. So his outlook is morbid and grim no matter which way you look at it. My word has that Saul said, they will abuse me, which is an understatement.
That's what this one says.
To capture and damage the first king of Israel is going to be a big perk. I mean, that would be like Al-Qaeda getting Trump or George W. Bush, even more to the point. Think about that. They've been able to capture and kill George W. That would have been huge and very depressing for us. You see what I'm saying? That's the kind of situation we're dealing with here. And Saul is not going to give the satisfaction of doing that because he knows what they do to leaders and kings and whatnot. And so he kills himself. Now, suicide by sword is not easy or painless. This is not something, I mean, you think people who have a gun to their head and they're going to commit suicide, that took a lot out of them, to get to that point. Taking your own sword and falling on it. They say, who's going to fall on the sword for, a political thing. This is where that comes from. But it's not quick and painless. This
Not
is
instantaneous.
No, and I think suicide rate would go down a lot more if that was the only way to go. You know what I'm saying? But his armor bearer stays around long enough to witness that Saul is in fact dead. That's key. That's important here. Saul's armor bearer right there waits until Saul is room temperature, and then he does the same. Right? Now, with the command structure destroyed, the battle goes from bad to worse. Mom, 7 through 10.
When the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled. And the Philistines came and occupied them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. Read 10 too.
Yes, ma'am.
They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtaroth and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan.
Okay, so here's a map to sort of like give you an idea. This is sort of an overall picture of the Philistines and Israel and all their conflicts, so it gets muddied up. but it's clear enough that I can show you. This is the area that the Philistines occupied. Remember, these are their cities. These five, Gaza, Gath, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron. Those are the five Philistine kingdoms. It's really like every mayor of each town was the king, and they dealt with things independently. Like, for example, the king of Gath allowed David to come in and stay. He didn't need to have those other guys, commune with him on that one. But when it came time to where they needed to unite, they all did.
Is that the same towns where the Ark of the Covenant caused trouble?
Yes. This is where things got really bad as far as the Ark was concerned. And as they tried to move it to Gath, the people of Gath said, "We don't want it." Gath, like I said before, is also Goliath's hometown. All right, and you notice that it's the most forward of the cities. It's the most forward as Gath is. Now, over here is the Jordan River. All right, the Dead Sea, and you got the Sea of Galilee up at the top off the page. So now you know generally where we are. I want to point out that this city that they mounted Saul's body to, right here in this area. All right, look how far away that is from the front. And remember, it says when the people that were on the other side of the Jordan saw this, they fled. So these people. So this is just a hard route pressing over. Israel is almost destroyed at this point because
the Philistines occupied this.
They do. They open. By the way, Hebron right here. This is where Abraham was underneath the tree when the angels came and told him that he was going to have a child, and his wife laughed. That's this area. Bethlehem right here. Anyway, so all of these areas now are under control, and they just keep going because it's like. In the Civil War, once Lee's army was gone, or Sherman coming through Georgia, there was nobody to stop him at that point. Same sort of thing here. Once they get here, it's just a route not from the military, because the military is no more, but the people in their towns and their house, they leave, and the Philistines occupy those towns. And so right over here, they take Saul's body and hang it up on the wall. Now. Something happens here that isn't mentioned between Saul's suicide and the Philistines decapitating him. All right, something very important, and we're going to find that out later. That another man has already come by and seen Saul's dead body and has done something and then leaves. And that's going to come up later. So I want to remind you that between the moment of Saul's suicide and the Philistines showing up the next day, something else important happens. But for now, they take his armor and they put it in the temples in the Asherah pole, right next to their orgy centers. And they set it right next to their temple god, just like they did to the ark, and you know how well that worked out for them. And then they take his body and fasten it to the wall of Beth-shan, which is a Philistine stronghold on the Jordan River. And not just Saul either; his body hangs alongside his 3 sons' bodies as well. This is one of the most eastern cities occupied by the Philistines at this point before this rout, and it just got worse after that. The archaeological site is a park today. It's a park that you go in and paid admission and get to see the ancient ruins of where Saul's body. Now they don't do reenactments, but this is what happened there, and it still is visible today. And Samuel's predictions came true. Saul, his sons, the army, and Israel as a whole, all conquered by the Philistines. But Saul's body won't stay there for too long. Pastor, can you read 11 through 13?
When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard of what the Philistines had done to Saul, and all the valiant men journeyed through the night to Beth-shan, they took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Beth-shan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days.
So the valiant men of the neighboring town, to me I'm assuming these were the guys that got routed in the previous battle, the guys that managed to get away. Anyway, so they go marching up to the walls and take down the bodies of their former nobility and cremate them, and then take the bones and bury those.
And so no opposition to do this?
It doesn't say that they had to fight their way to it. It says valiant men. It doesn't say that. And I think the word valiant in there indicates that there probably was the bravery. It was a brave thing to do, because then they had to go past the other Philistines that had occupied their own territories and go in and get it. So, and then they fasted for 7 days. Now, I wonder what David's going to think when he finds out about this. LG, can you read verses 1 through 6 in 2 Samuel?
2 Samuel.
2 Samuel 1. Verses 1 through 6.
1 through what?
6.
Now it came to pass after the death of Saul, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, and David had abided 2 days in Ziklag. It came even to pass on the 3rd day that, behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul with his head, clothes rent and earth upon his head. And so it was when he came to David that he fell to the earth and did a bit Absalom's. And David said unto him, From whence camest thou? And he said unto him, Out of the camp of Israel, and I escaped. And David said unto him, How went the matter? I pray thee, tell me. And the servant that the people are fled from the battle, and many of the people also are fallen and dead. And Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead also. And David said unto the young man that told him, How knowest that Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead? And the young man that told him said, As I happened by chance upon Mount Gibeon, behold, Saul leaned upon his spear, and lo, the chariots and horsemen followed hard after him.
Okay, so David is just done with that divine distraction that we discussed last week, and he's get back to Ziklag. He's trying to establish order again, and he's already bribed all the other neighborhoods, remember, around him, with all the other good loot. And he just got back from completing that when this guy shows up and tells David what had happened at the battle. And David asks for proof that Saul and Jonathan are dead. By the way, side note, no problem that you couldn't pronounce the other 2 sons, because they're not even mentioned here. You know, it just says, tell me Saul and Jonathan, how you know they're dead. You know, it doesn't mention the other 2. Now, up to this point, we know Saul was being pursued by the Philistines and fell on his own sword. Okay, this guy, this is the guy I mentioned earlier that has shown up between the 2 episodes, between Saul's death and the Philistines decapitating Saul. But what happens next is unfortunate. This guy feels led to embellish a little bit on the truth. The concept is that if David is Saul's enemy, maybe there's a reward for assisting in Saul's demise. So this guy's going to fudge the truth a little bit. Sweetheart, 7 through 10.
I'll talk to
When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, What can I do?
Oh, hold on. When we get to this, who is the he and whatever. So Saul turned. So Saul's not dead yet. His armor bearer is already dead. Now we know what happened to it.
But that ain't the way it works.
Exactly. So Saul turns, sees this guy, just happened to be there, and says this.
He asked me, Who are you? An Amalekite, I answered. Then he said to me, Stand here by me and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I am still alive. What?
10.
10. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arms, and I brought them to you here, my lord.
All right, so do you see what he did here? He lied to curry favor with David. We know that the armor bearer waited until Saul was dead before he offed himself. Right? This guy claims that Saul was still alive, yet mortally wounded, and he did everybody the favor of killing Saul. That's the way he's trying to portray it. It has the advantage of looking compassionate, yet also helpful to David. You know, he was in misery. I put him out, but and here's his crown and his armband to prove it to you. Now, so that's why I said I know that he went there because he's got that crown and armband, but Saul was already dead at that point. But this guy thinks that he's going to score some points here by doing this. This is the thing that Saul's armor bearer refused to do. Remember that. I mean, Saul's armor bearer, I'm not doing that. So what he really did is he came across Saul's corpse, took the crown and armband, and then took off out of there before the Philistines could get him. If he just told the truth, he would have had a much better ending to his story. As it stands, he wants the reward, and he embellished a bit. So let's see what the fruit of his labors are. 11 through
He's gonna
16.
get a reward, I can tell you that. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and likewise all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening. for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. How many?
To 16.
And David said unto the young man who told him, From where art thou? And he answered, I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite. And David said unto him, How wast thou not afraid to stretch forth thine hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Of course, this is the same thing they would have asked that armor bearer.
It would have been. Yep.
And David called one of the young men and said, Go near and fall upon him. And he smote him so that he died. And David said unto him, Thy blood be upon thy head, for thy mouth has testified against thee, saying, I have slain the Lord's anointed.
I'm pretty sure this isn't the reward the guy was hoping for.
How did he know? How did he know that?
He did. But, I mean, that's the way, once again, though, I've got to point out, David does not act the way the rest of the world does. An enemy would say, well, I'm glad you did it, you know. But this guy doesn't know that David had multiple chances to do it and refused to do it because God told him not to. He was still the anointed king, regardless of how, until God takes care of Saul, he's still the king. That was the way David felt about it.
So we have to assume that God told David that this guy's lying, and he killed. He didn't.
It may very, and he doesn't. That doesn't really matter. He says your own mouth has testified against you.
I don't understand that part.
Because he said I killed him. He's pleading guilty to killing Saul right away. He's saying he was laying there dead, dying, and I run him through and did the final blow and killed him.
He was God's anointed. He wasn't supposed to do that.
Yeah, you just let God deal with him.
Well, again, like I said, the same question would have been asked to that armor bearer had he done.
Exactly, and he was terrified he wouldn't do it.
But yeah.
But so David asked him, "Why weren't you afraid to kill God's anointed king? What did that never cross your mind?" And David has had that opportunity numerous times, over and over, and he never pulled the trigger on him. But he executes this man because his own mouth testified against him. He called himself out as being a murderer. Even though he thought that he was going to be praised for it, it did not have the result that he was expecting. Instead of gaining favor, this guy signs his own death warrant. Honesty truly is the best policy. If you just come across a dead king and you grab his crown, just say that. Don't add to make yourself...
Leave the crown alone. Just get out of it.
I just sneak away.
I mean...
Now this guy
the best
lied.
thing I could do if I were he was just to get out of it.
So what did this guy honestly do to warrant a death sentence? He didn't kill anybody. He just said he did. He lied. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Now David makes a poetic lament and insists that all of Israel memorize it. And that's what the next set of these verses is. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to point out a couple of things in here. Verse 21 and 22, if you follow along with me, it says, Mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain. May no showers fall upon your terraced fields. For there the shield of the mighty was despised. The shield of Saul no longer rubbed with oil. So I did some research. You know what's happening at Mount Gilboa right now? They've tried to archaeologically reclaim it, and they just can't. Every time they try to plant things with irrigation and modern resources and fertilizers, they just can't get anything to grow there. This lament still...
Where is that? Gilboa?
Mount Gilboa, yeah. So this lament where he says, may no showers fall on your terraced fields, and may you have neither dew nor rain, they can't get anything to grow there to this very day. And in the next set it says, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, the sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan in life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. Seriously, Saul's other two sons must have been real nobodies. I mean, they don't even get mentioned in the epitaph at the end of it. And it is a wonderful epitaph for Saul and Jonathan. David says, as a poet, he's got this songwriting skill, so he uses them. He's saying how great a king he was and how well he treated his subject. There's no mention of his spear-throwing tendencies. There's no mention of that evil spirit that plagued him perpetually. Just the standard well wishes of a dead king. We still to this day have a hard time talking bad about the dead. And there's no difference here. Of course, now there's a vacancy in the royal throne room.
Well, let's see.
Saul and all his male heirs are gone. And that's the typical way that king's lineage is through sons. So now we know that David was chosen and anointed way back in 1 Samuel 16, almost 18 years before today's lesson. However, Israel doesn't know that because the ceremony was done secretly to prevent Saul from getting paranoid and trying to kill him. Oops. It turns out that was a waste of time. Anyway, so next week we see David ascend to the throne and a truly remarkable period in Hebrew history begins.
That's interesting that nothing still grows.
To this day. Yes, sir.
That's interesting.